Let's get started. Okay, I'm Andrew. Yeah, I think you know that already from Walk, Listen, Create. We try to support our writers in residence. They're the winners of a competition that we run. And Cheryl was our writer in residence last year. And what we say is, if you come up with an idea and you want to give it a go, we'll try and support you as best we can. And she said, well, I'd like to do a double act. I'd like to do a salon where I chat with Kerri Andrews and follow it up with a writing workshop. So there's a writing workshop next week on Thursday, the 30th, which Cheryl will be leading. So it'd be really great if you guys could come. But it will be recorded, so it will be available afterwards, but it's always better to be there. Cheryl herself, let me introduce you, Cheryl, and I'm going to just read her bio, which she's added to the Walk, Listen, Create website. So Cheryl Markosky wanted to be a lighthouse keeper, but it was tricky in the Rockies. So she became a TV producer and journalist. Canadian born, she now splits her time between England and the Caribbean. Gosh, that is so tough, Cheryl. Cheryl's work can be found in Ellipsis Zine, New Flash Fiction Review, Mrs. Lexia, the Urban Tree Festival, the Cabinet of Heed, Janus Literary, and National Flash Fiction Day and the Flash Fiction Festival anthologies. And she's proud to have been Walk, Listen, Create's Flash Fiction Writer in Residence 22 to 23. So I'm going to hand over to Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, tonight I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kerri Andrews, who'll be discussing her new book. Hold it up here. It's called Waymakers, an anthology of women's writing about walking. And it was recently published. Kerri's both an author and an academic, specializing in women's literature and the history of walking. She's also a keen hill walker and a Munro bagger. And for those of you outside the UK, a Munro is a Scottish mountain, which I believe is above 3,000 feet. Is that right, Kerri? And to bag one, you have to reach the top, basically. So she's obviously a very good walker. Kerri's previous book, published in 2021, was Wanderers, A History of Women Walking, which focuses on 10 women over the past 3 centuries who found walking vital to themselves as individuals and also as writers. So I'm going to talk to Kerri about Waymakers in particular, and then open up the discussion. So please feel free to ask Kerri questions or comment on anything that she's discussing. Now, first of all, I just wanted to say that Remarkably, Waymakers, I've discovered, is the first anthology of women's writing about walking, which is quite crazy because you'd think someone would have done this before, with extracts from writers' letters, diaries, poetry and novels. So it's a lovely mix of fiction and nonfiction. It's from Mary Wollstonecraft, wishing to vagabondize, great word, one day in the country with her lover. Virginia Woolf's current of sensation and ideas awakened when walking. To Katherine Mansfield's Game in Paris, walking and talking with the dead who smile, are silent and free. I thought that was beautiful. And in addition, there's Sarah Moss's heroine, Kate, who takes an illegal but much needed walk under strict lockdown rules. And Anna Setti walking the Pennine Way as a woman of color and sticking out like a sore brown thumb, she says. There's also peril in walking, as demonstrated by Raynor Wynne in The Salt Path. Stupid to think we could walk this path, to not have enough money, to pretend we weren't homeless, to get the court procedure wrong, to lose the children's home, to not have enough water, to pretend we weren't dying, to not have enough water. Stupid, stupid, stupid. And of course, I have to mention Elizabeth Bennet in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, walking to see her sister Lizzie in the Bingleys' rather posh house, turning up with her dirty stockings after jumping over puddles, and a face glowing with the warmth of exercise, heaven forbid. So Kerri, To kick off, I just wanted to ask you, why hasn't anyone produced an anthology of women's writing about walking before? And does that mean walking is a man's world?
Well, I think you probably know how I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to absolutely say no, walking isn't a man's world whatsoever. But I think writing about walking has been. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that women have been walking for as long as walking has existed. Where I live in the Scottish borders, there's a number of paths. They're called the creel paths, and they're the routes that the fishwives took from the coast in East Berwickshire into the borders where the markets were, with creels of fish and lobsters on their head, walking through the country over the hills and then back again. So this was a perfectly ordinary thing for them to do. That's how they got their catch to market. And there are, hundreds of examples across the country of pragmatic paths like that have come about from people undertaking the ordinary business of everyday life before cars were invented. So I think that's partly what we need to remember, is how embedded walking has been in human existence. It's not a man's or a woman's thing, it's human. I think since people have had more leisure time and more money and more freedom to do things for the fun of it rather than the necessity, then things have perhaps started to shift a bit. But even here, the historical record's really clear that women are there with their leisure time. They've got less of it because they have less money, but when they have it, they do, just like men do, seek out walking as an activity. So I think that's all really important to remember. Somehow, though, we've come to assume that the only people who write about it or have anything sensible to say about it are men. And that's, I think, a lot to do with people not bothering to check the basic premise. The assumptions have been made, years and years and years worth of assumptions have accreted. And I think that's what I hope to sort of address in Wanderers, and it's also what I hope to address in Waymakers. Waymakers, I said this at an early event, and I kind of mind hitting somebody with the book, and everybody laughed in the audience, but I'm not sure if it was sort of the crazy person laugh. But it was an attempt to make it impossible. This book, I literally wanted to, you cannot write this about women anymore. We have been walking. We are walking. Look at all this stuff. It's been here for years. Why didn't you look for it? So I'm hoping that Waymakers and Wanderers together make it impossible for anyone to claim, as people have been claiming in the last 10 years, that, well, if women walked, it wasn't that significant. And, well, we know they weren't walking because they were too scared to. People just didn't bother to check those assumptions that they probably held for many years about what women could and couldn't do. So I guess that's partly why I think people haven't done an anthology before. They just made assumptions that women hadn't written about this. And if they had, well, it wouldn't be very interesting, would it? But it really is, and they really have.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Now, you mentioned about the danger. Do you think that, because you do have some extracts in here that are tinged with danger and fear, as well as freedom, though, because women had the freedom. Could you just tell us a bit more about that? And I don't know if you have any examples, because I think that's interesting.
Sure. One of the things I was struck with when writing both Waymakers and then compiling Wanderers was how infrequently women speak of fear. And I think for a lot of us, we're assuming that they would have written about the fear of sexual assault. But there was only one that I came across, and that was Cheryl Strayed, and that isn't actually, it's an anticipated fear rather than the fear of something that does eventually happen. So it's really infrequent. Dorothy Wordsworth in the early 19th century has a bit of a moment of abject panic. She gets very paranoid in the middle of nowhere, deep in Lanarkshire, about who may or may not have been following her. But these are rarities. They're significant because they're infrequent. What's much more typical in the accounts that I've gathered is this kind of unconscious assumption that, well, of course we've gone walking. What are you talking about? People not even aware that it's a significant thing that they're doing. It's so habitual. So I think that's actually more typical. And one of the things that I think it's perhaps important to remember for us at the moment is that the place where women are most in danger is the home. And that's been the case for a long time. The place we are not in danger typically is outside walking. Now, yes, there are isolated incidents where women are assaulted, and there have been some horrible recent documented cases of that. But on the whole, statistically, inside in the home with men is where we're in danger. And for a lot of the women in Waymakers, I think that's, you can kind of feel that where there is an unpleasant man in the family, you know, an abusive husband, or, you know, an adulterous lecher, that away from the home is safety. That is where mental freedom exists. That's where physical comfort exists. Being in the home is torment. So I think there are really quite striking parallels between the way in which women historically have sought refuge from home outside. And I think that's true. That's a thread, I think, that runs through a lot of the writing about walking that I've gathered together.
Yeah, and I think there's a tinge too of, you know, women should know better than to go out and about, and their place is in the home. And therefore it's their own fault if they go out and walk. I felt that on occasions too, that you're trying to get rid of that belief.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's another lazy assumption, and I think it's dangerous in a way because it misplaces where genuine danger actually exists. It makes women fearful of the place where they're more likely to be safe. It inverts the actual threat, and I think we should resist that. That for many of us, for many centuries, outside has been a sanctuary. It is still a sanctuary and can still be a sanctuary for many of us. And yes, there are absolutely concerns to take about mountain safety or general walking safety. I mean, even you hear stories of people falling down at the bottom of their local park, and it's still being, you know, away enough from people that poses problems. So yes, some basic precautions about, you know, have your phone with you. But beyond that, outside is genuinely and generally a wonderful place for people to be. And I think that's something that really does warrant remembering and stressing. Yeah.
Now, something else that came from the book is that you mentioned that walking is a source of creativity and comfort for women. I don't know if you have any examples of this from the book, and whether you could explain this, because I thought it was extremely positive and good.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I think walking for a lot of women is deeply tied into that sense of space, a free, you know, space to think, space to reflect. And one of the things I wanted to do with Wanderers was represent how walking is used creatively as well in various ways. You know, the physical act is creative, but the idea of walking is also creative. And I think one of the extracts that perhaps best represents that is part of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's wonderful poem novel Aurora Leigh, which has got a really striking use of walking. And I think that sort of exemplifies some of what I've just been saying. So if it's okay, I'll read a bit from Aurora Leigh just to sort of illustrate what I mean. So in this extract, Aurora Leigh is being courted by Romney, who's come to call on her at her aunt's house. And she's in the process of turning him down with significant personal consequences. So this is her speaking her internal monologue. And I, who spoke the truth then, stand upright, still worthy of having spoken out the truth. By being content I spoke it, though it set him there, me here. Woman's vile remorse to hanker after a mere name, a show, a supposition, a potential love. Does every man who names love in our lives become a power for that? Is love's true thing so much best to us that what personates love is next best? A potential love, forsooth. We are not so vile. No, he cleaves, I think, this man, this image, chiefly for the wrong and shock he gave my life in finding me precisely where the devil of my youth had set me, on those mountain peaks of hope, all glittering with the dawn dew, all erect and famished for the morning, saying, while I looked for empire and much tribute, come, I have some worthy work for thee below. Come, sweep my barns and keep my hospitals. and I will pay thee with a current coin, which men give women. As we spoke, the grass was trod in haste beside us, and my aunt, with smile distorted by the sun, face, voice, as much at issue with the summer day as if he brought a candle out of doors, broke in with, "Romney here? My child, entreat your cousin to the house, and have your talk, if girls must talk on their birthdays. Come." He answered for me calmly, with pale lips that seemed to motion for a smile in vain. "The talk is ended, madam, where we stand. Your brother's daughter has dismissed me here, and all my answer can be better said beneath the trees than wrong by such a word your house's hospitalities. Farewell." With that he vanished. I could hear his heel ring bluntly in the lane as down he leapt the short way from us. Then a measured speech withdrew me. "What means this, Aurora Lee? My brother's daughter has dismissed my guests." The lion in me felt my keeper's voice through all its quivering dewlaps. I was quelled before her, and meekened to the child she knew. I prayed her pardon, said I had little thought to give dismissal to a guest of hers, and letting go a friend of mine who came to take me into service as a wife. No more than that, indeed. "No more, no more, pray heaven," she answered, "that I was not mad. I could not mean to tell her to her face that Romney Lee had asked me for a wife, and I refused him." "Did he ask?" I said. "I think he rather stooped to take me up for certain uses which he found to do for something called a wife. He never asked." "What stuff," she answered. "Are they queens, these girls, that must have mantles stitched with 20 silks spread out upon the ground before they'll step one footstep for the noblest lover born?" "But I am born," I said with firmness. "I, to walk another way than his, dear aunt." You walk. A babe at 13 months will walk as well as you," she cried in haste, "without a steadying finger. Why, you child, God help you, you are groping in the dark for all this sunlight. You suppose, perhaps, that you, sole offspring of an opulent man, are rich and free to choose which way to walk. You think, and it's a reasonable thought, that I, besides being well-to-do in life, will leave my handful in my niece's hand, when death shall paralyze these fingers? Pray, pray, child, albeit I know you love me not, as if you loved me, that I may not die. For when I die and leave you, out you go. Unless I make room for you in my grave, unhoused, unfed, my dear poor brother's lamb, without a right to crop a single blade of grass beneath these trees, or cast a lamb's small shadow on the lawn, unfed, unfolded."
Yeah. Thank you very much. Powerful.
It's really powerful, and I think one of the reasons I like that so much is that it's just such an evocative use of that metaphor of walking, the freedom to choose a path, to determine where your steps go, to follow where you know, to follow that route forwards, and that being absolutely contested here. Her aunt making absolutely clear the economic penalties for following your own path, the determination in the narration there of Aurora Lee to resist all of that and still have the courage to follow her own path, and also that, you know, almost on the side, that wonderful takedown of the awfulness of marriage. It's just absolutely wonderful, you know, how closely connected for Elizabeth Barrett Browning the patriarchal norms that restrict women, and contrasting that with this freedom that you can feel Aurora Lee yearning for, to set out on life's path in a way that's honest to her, true to her sense of self and of self-worth. And I think that speaks to so much of what goes on for women writers about walking. If they're not doing that literally, they're doing it metaphorically. That if they are not literally setting out on a path because it's so important to their sense of selves, then they're writing about characters for whom walking really, really matters. And that's just interwoven through so much of the writing about walking that I've encountered. And it's just incredibly powerful, and how beautifully articulate Barrett Browning is about that being a fundamental element of any life well lived, that determination to decide where you go, on what path you tread. As I say, that's one of my very favourite extracts. I wouldn't want to choose a favourite, be like choosing a child, you know, my favourite child. I couldn't possibly do it, but it's one of my favourites for all of those reasons I've just outlined.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. And the other one I really liked was a Sarah Moss
Yes.
extract from her novel The Fell, which is a lockdown novel, and
Yes.
it's about this character desperate to get out and walk, and she's forbidden to do so. No one's allowed to leave their home, and it's such a wonderful plea from her, isn't it, to just get out there, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's and if anyone hasn't read it, it's very much worth your time. It's a great novel of a very difficult period, and it articulates, you know, I think Moss is a really good writer of interiorities and how people's inner lives function. And she really captures, I think, that something of what Barrett Browning is also talking about, how it's fundamental to these women's sense of self, being out on the fells. Moss then also explores, and this is not to give away too many spoilers, but the consequences of exercising that freedom of other people being out as well, and the risks and dangers too, but they don't come from where you expect. And I think that's also really nice, that there are a couple of obvious ways the story could have gone, but she doesn't take any of them. It's really powerful, I think.
Yeah. And there's also funny moments in this book. Well, I found them funny anyway. I don't know if anybody else would. Like Dorothy Wordsworth is forever going on walks to get the bloody post over and over again. And then sometimes she has to walk all the way to Ambleside, and then she'll end up walking back with somebody else, or something else happens. But I thought it was quite poignant, because I thought she was quite lonely, and she always seems to be waiting for her brothers to come back, or to get their letters. And it's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of speaks to the, you know, how embedded walking is to everyday life up until, I don't know, a ways into the 20th century, because even after cars are invented, it's a long time before they're readily available to people. So I think, you know, reading Dorothy Wordsworth's accounts and other women as well. So Mary Shelley's journals have a similar terse, you know, well, obviously I went walking. So Mary Shelley's journals also, you know, walked, read, worked, slept. And it's just there in the rhythms of the day that obviously you go to walk. Obviously you have to walk to run errands, because the post doesn't come that far up into the Lake District. You have to go and get it. I don't know that she was lonely, though. I think one of the things about Dorothy's walking that I really value, and which since writing about her I've tried to bring into my own walking, is that sense that she has of these populated paths, of laying down memories on these routes that she walks over and over again, either because of, you know, pragmatic reasons like I've got to get the post, or because that's where she happened to walk with her brothers or with her sister-in-law. And then all of these people are somehow still on the path. And every time she walks that route, she's able to pick them up and pick up the memories associated with that walk and carry them with her. So I don't know that she's ever truly alone. And then elsewhere, when she's a little bit more irascible, she actively hates people coming up and walking with her. There are letters where she, well, it was very nice of her to offer, but I very much wish she'd just gone home, and things like that. So I think for her, walking was a companionable activity. It was absolutely something that she enjoyed doing with her family and friends. But solitary walking was also really important, and she get pretty narked if people intruded upon that, when she preferred to be alone. So it's an interesting blend with that. And then you can see in her journals when she's off in Scotland, when she's the second time when she goes back with her sister-in-law, who's not the fastest walker and is a little bit prone to drama about, oh, it's just too far, and all my feet hurt, and all this and all that. And just this absolute intolerance for someone else slowing her down. You get the feeling that she very much wishes she could have ditched her sister-in-law and then just kept going, and would have been perfectly content just stomping through Scotland solo. So I think company and solitude with Dorothy are always in an interesting tension. And I think that's really lovely. One of the things I really enjoy about her writing about walking.
Yeah. Thank you. Now we got some good questions here in the chat, Kerri. Natalie's saying walking to escape seems to be more prevalent in women walker writers than with the male counterpoints. Would you say as this is the case, maybe reflective of societal pressures, or are these female accounts just more evocative? It's a brilliant question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thanks ever so much, Natalie. My first instance, I don't know, but I'm going to try and work out an answer as I go, which may or may not be successful. So we'll see where we end up. Part of what happens in accounts by men, I think, from the ones that I've read, and if I'm doing a disservice to men's writing about walking, please, someone do jump in and save me from myself. But my sense is that they focus quite a lot more on conquering, on overcoming a physical object in front of them, mountains, bogs, whatever, some sort of grand territorial conquest. And they also tend not to reflect openly on their domestic circumstances. And I mean, even really current male writers don't tend to do that. I was reading one about Central Asia recently, and definitely got a family at home, not too fussed about explaining how he comes to be away for weeks on end. Whereas I don't think women are enabled to get away with that, that when women write about walking, there's an expectation that they have to explain who's looking after the children. I mean, I got this last night, I went swimming. Oh, who's looking after your children? Well, their father, obviously, because they're his children too. And it wasn't possible for, well, if a woman is out walking, can we not just assume that someone responsible is at home, in the way that men seem able to just, well, obviously I was walking because someone is responsible for the home. So I think there are different, perhaps unconscious rules, very subtle rules about what it is permissible for women to say and how they have to preface their accounts of walking. I think that there are different rules that apply to women and to men. And I also think genuinely different circumstances that women still bear the burden of childcare disproportionately to men. Women still, and study after study after study, this is not controversial to say, women bear a disproportionate amount of the burden of domestic labour, of the mental load, the emotional work. All of that falls far more to women than it does to men. Even in households where men think they're doing 50% of the work, they are not doing 50% of the work. So I think that then creates a greater need for women when they do get out to then talk about that sense of, oh, thank God, oh, thank goodness I'm out, thank goodness I'm away from whatever, I've got some time to be myself, I've got some time to feel connected to something other than the needs of other people. I think that's a really peculiar combination of circumstances that we've loaded onto women through historical norms, through continuing social assumptions about who does and does not do domestic labour. And I think that then inflects what women are able to write about walking. And I think that's perhaps partly at work when publishers are reluctant to publish books by women about walking, because it's not very often, though it is sometimes, about I went and conquered this this pesky peak, and I went and nearly died on Everest, or whichever peak this man has gone and nearly died on, because so many of them seem to just nearly die on stuff and have a horrible time while they're doing it. Women seem to have less time for that nonsense because they genuinely are doing other things when they're walking a lot of the time. I'm speaking in broad strokes here. There are, of course, women who love to go up big mountains and suffer just as anybody else seems to like to do. But on the whole, I think there are quite a lot of other pressures involved on women, and their writing tends to reflect that. So that was really long-winded and may or may not have ever come anywhere close to the question. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk wildly about gendered assumptions and walking, and I hope that does come close to answering the question somehow.
Yes, Natalie, did you want to come back on any of that, or you?
I mean, it was a wonderful response. I very much enjoyed it. It kind of even prompted some very quick reflections on my own work and thinking back when I wrote the acknowledgements for my thesis, I spent time to say how lovely it had been as an escape. To work on my PhD was an escape, and I felt the need to put it in there. And even I've recently had my corrections back, and one of the suggestions was that I might not want to put that at the front. I might not want to set this tone that I'd overcome so much to be able to do this work. And it's strange that my natural reaction was to want to put it in there to justify that I'd escaped through this work. So I find it really interesting that there's this there are these norms that I think that we feel we need to play into, and I felt the need to say, you know, I managed to do this, but I still looked after my child, I still looked after my mum. Like there was the need to preface that, and it's strange.
I think
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
ask permission, don't we?
Yeah, and also have to say, I've already done all my caring duties. This is on top of all of that. Whereas I'm not sure men necessarily feel the need to go, I have done all my caring first. Now I will take 2 seconds out of 24 hours to do something for myself. I'm not sure that quite applies in the same way. So no, I understand. And I also understand the instinct to do that. I'm just finishing up a book which will hopefully be out next year. And in the end of that, one of the decisions I've taken is to explicitly say how much the childcare has cost over the period of writing the book, and it's somewhere in the region of £22,000, and that's not even including all the extra childcare that my children's father has done unpaid. So it's just a huge amount, and I felt it was important to acknowledge that, in part because so many accounts, usually by men, just assume that, well, it just sort of magically happens, and it really doesn't magically happen. If we're not doing it, there is somebody else doing it, and who is that, and what's the cost of that? So I'm hoping that that's a step that perhaps goes some way to, I'm not apologizing for what I've done. I'm very glad to have had the time, and I don't feel any apology needed for taking that time. But I have felt the need to say, and this is what it costs, and this is why people can't do it very much, because it's £22,000.
I mean, that's amazing that you're putting that in, and it does not surprise me at all that that's the cost. I'll just say.
No, I calculated, I just sat there aghast going, oh my goodness me, what could we have done with that money? But, you know, well, I turned it into a book, so hopefully it will be worth something.
Hopefully. Now, Andrew's asking, how is it possible for women like Mary Wollstonecraft to travel independently so far across Europe? I was surprised to learn that she'd written about a trip she'd made as far as Scandinavia, walking through Northern Europe.
Yeah, well, Mary Wollstonecraft is an unusual case. I don't know how typical or representative this is because of the circumstances of this journey. So people may or may not be familiar with this. So apologies if I'm explaining this to anybody who's, you know, a Wollstonecraft aficionado. But she was in Europe, in Scandinavia, because she was commissioned on a shady deal whose details remain a little fuzzy by her ex-lover, Gilbert Imlay, who was an American with diplomatic connections, who was undertaking some sort of mercantile, not entirely above board deal with people in Scandinavia. And Mary Wollstonecraft did not know this at this time, but he had ditched her and was already living with another woman while she was left with their infant child. I don't think Fanny was a year old yet. She would come home and find that he'd shacked up with somebody else. There was a whole horror of things yet to come. But she was out there on his commission. It was to do with silver being lost in a ship, I think. And so she was traveling through Denmark into Norway and Sweden in order to make the connections and try and complete the deal on his behalf. Why he couldn't do it himself, we say the details are a little bit fuzzy. But that's why she was out there. So she kind of had male license in a way, but she was also traveling with her daughter and with a nurse to help look after her child, so with the child's nanny. And there are some really moving moments in the account that she wrote about that, about reflecting on what it was to raise a daughter in this incredibly misogynistic world. And the thoughts of that are really quite upsetting. And that's partly why she ends up going off for these walks along cliff faces, trying to find some sort of solace as a woman who knows exactly what it is to be a woman in this world and knows what she's letting her daughter in for. So that's all part of it. What wasn't published in her account was the letters that she was sending back home to Imlay himself, who's in London, now shacked up with the next woman. And they are increasingly bitter as she starts to sense his distance and his indifference to her and their child. And she makes some really quite powerful pleas and then some really quite powerful threats about what she's going to do to secure their daughter's future despite him. So there's this whole sort of subtext there. So it's an incredible journey for a lot of reasons. That said, there were women heading off to the continent quite frequently. Charlotte Smith, another woman who was walking not necessarily huge distances, but around the coast in Sussex, heads off to France to escape her husband's creditors. Helen Maria Williams goes off to France in the same period and goes and watches the first anniversary of the French Revolution. So you've got quite a lot of women heading over to Europe. I think revolutionary Europe was perhaps a little bit more welcoming than Britain necessarily was at this time, because there's a few of them that go off and do it. So I think the opportunity was there a little bit more perhaps than it had been. So yeah, it's more common than we think. And again, you know, people are still needing to, if you did not have money, you were walking because you couldn't afford to hire a horse. So Mary Shelley, 20 years after her mother heads off to Europe, is also walking around Europe on a walking tour, sometimes on donkey back, sometimes on foot, but it's a 6 weeks tour. And she's walking in London, she's walking in Germany, she's walking in the Alps. So all of that is part of the mix too. So as soon as you start looking, you suddenly realize that, okay, these women aren't actually outliers at all. There's for a lot of these women, it just wasn't that remarkable, or it wasn't remarkable enough to them to be worth documenting. And that's for me is also interesting, that for us, it's like, oh my goodness, look at you, you brave person. But they're like, well, I went for a walk. Well, of course I went for a walk. That's what we do. So there's an interesting historical gap, I think, there between how walking for us is absolutely just about, you know, you don't necessarily walk unless you have to or unless you really want to, whereas walking was habitual. And I think that makes quite a bit of difference. But yeah, Wollstonecraft's case, all sorts of nefarious skullduggery, and an absolute cad, a complete bounder of a man, right in the middle of it, directing everything that she was up to, which is makes it even more poignant, I think.
And Natalie, you've also mentioned, I think this is fascinating, of how walking practice inspired you greatly as an approach to understanding place. How is it formed, how it can be understood, not just from your perspective, but others. I think that's fascinating. Is this something you're working on in your thesis? Is this?
Yes, quite a bit. So my thesis itself was focused on developing a method to access embodied knowledge of place. And I ended up drawing very heavily on walking practices from that, not just for the method in kind of walking through place, but for how I then understood place as a thing. And I kind of lent quite heavily on this palimpsestic quality of place and how it's formed through all the traces of movement through it. And as I was shaping that, the kind of reading of Dorothy Wordsworth from Wanderers very much kind of informed my thinking about how she was laying down these traces, but also how she tried to then engage with her brother's traces in Europe and try and see how he may have experienced it. And there's more modern examples of people doing the same thing and having similar kind of understandings. And I kind of carried this forward into my thesis, but also a little paper that I wrote with a colleague, Simon King, who is a walking practitioner, and we tried to have a conversation in place where he was invited into my traces in place and I was invited into his kind of imaginary of place. So there's lots of different elements tying in there, and I felt like walking was the connecting piece.
Brilliant, brilliant. And there's a lot of examples of that, I would say, in your book, Kerri, aren't there?
Yeah, I think so. It's as you were talking about how I think it's it's a lovely thing about Dorothy, and that in 1790 when William's off touring Europe, she's there walking backwards and forwards in a domestic space, trying to grasp something of what he's doing, trying to reach that connection with him. I think that's really evocative and provocative as well. And then you contrast that with someone like Ellen Wheaton, who had ambitions to walk long distances and who couldn't, because she couldn't work out how to make the accommodation work, because where William Wordsworth on his tour just rocked up at people's houses and slept in their barns, that was very much less an option for Ellen Wheaton. So she ended up not being able to do the long distance tours, but was later able to find more organized accommodation, and from there sort of then sort of branch out, you know, have a base and then roam. And then that becomes really quite powerful. So yeah, it's interesting how differently men and women are able to access space, but those differences don't mean that they can't do it. It just means it looks a bit different. So it's interesting to hear you talking about those, you being invited into your male colleague's space, and then what that might have been to have a male colleague invited into your space, and the different associations and connections that we perhaps bring to bear as we create those spaces through the accretion of memories, the accretion of encounters. Just thinking about my own walking, when I've walked on my own, there's a lovely walk near me that goes above the Yarrow Valley. So I live in the Tweed Valley, and the Yarrow is the one sort of behind. There's this wonderful walk from the Yarrow Valley where you can go up onto the hilltops, and you're in between the two valleys there. And I've done that walk with friends. I've done it with a working colleague. I've done it with my partner. And I've done it alone. And a couple of times I've done it alone. And when I've done it alone, I've had these really odd but lovely random meetings with women on horseback, because it's also part of it runs over the Southern Upland Way. And I just stopped to chat to these women as they were coming down the hill, you know, magnificently and very much more comfortably than I was going down on my own 2 feet. And then when I met them at the bottom of the hill much later, when they got stuck, they couldn't work out how to get the horses out and where to take them, we had a nice chat. And then I just ran into a woman who just happened to have bought the nearby house, who then invited me to her garden, which she was very proud of, and was doing up. And the walk actually gets diverted around the garden. It used to run through. It used to be a youth hostel, and now it's the diversion through this beautiful birch woodland. So I got to see all the changes, and this would never have happened if I'd have been here with any of the other groups that I've visited this place with. So all of that's got layered on top. And I think those encounters are the ones that I remember the most, those weird happenstance moments on the path. And those are really powerful. And you know, perhaps like Dorothy, I like company just fine, but there's something very special about walking alone and then being open to those, you know, serendipitous moments that bring real power and magic, I think, to walking.
Yeah, I think you're more likely to talk to someone if you're alone, whereas if you're with someone else, they assume you're going to talk to your companion, and it's not the same, is it? It's great to have those sort of mad conversations with people that you don't expect. But now, anybody else want to ask something? Sorry, we're sort of, anyone else who's here? Or suggest or to ask anything? Anne, anything from your American perspective?
Sorry, I got here a little late because there was a sign-in issue, so I came in in the end. I mean, I think this is really interesting, and the thing what Natalie said about the palimpsestic walking. I mean, I never had heard it, you know, this idea of walking in the footsteps or the traces of others, and I'd never thought about it quite that way before, of adding that you're adding your own layer to it. I've almost thought of it more as a kind of witnessing or an uncovering. So I really like that. That's really given me an interesting frame to think about. I think for Kerri, I mean, this idea of walking as a woman and walking, there's this walking alone and the heightened awareness that one always carries with one. I don't know if that's something that you already talked about, but there is this, I feel, even in places that I feel quite safe or that are reasonably quite safe, there's just something, it's something in me goes on alert. And I always admire people, especially women who go out into wilder places, like alone on hiking trails and things like that, who are able to do that, because I don't think that I would really be able to do that completely on my own. I could do solo up to a point, but there are certain places that I would never, it just would be the anxiety factor would be too high.
No, I think quite a few people share, you know, those reservations. I don't know. I've never really felt that. I'm 6 foot tall, so that's a good start. I am not slight, so it would take you probably need a articulated lorry to kidnap me. A lot of cake is keeping me from being whisked away against my will. So that's probably been quite protective, that I look physically, more like a man than a woman necessarily. But I do know what you mean. When I've walked alone, my risk setting is quite a lot lower than that I'm willing to tolerate. So I have done a few Munros on my own, but when I last did it, I chose a route that was going to be visible, that I wasn't going to have to route find. I chose a route that had a very high start point. So yes, we have to go up over 3,000 feet in Scotland, but there are a few mountains where you've got, you can start at something like 1,600 feet, so you get halfway up the mountain, which is wonderful. So I chose one of those where it was going to be a little bit physically easier, and then I made it a popular mountain. So I knew if I needed to get any help or if anything happened, I wouldn't be dying on down a corrie or somewhere where no one would find me. All of that was in my planning. What I hadn't appreciated was there would be a quadrathlon being run through these mountains. And that's what I would actually be craving, was solitude by the end of it, because there were so many people, all of them insane, because they just swum across Loch Tay. We're now running all 7 of the Munros in this grouping above Loch Tay. And then they were going to cycle around the loch, and then they were going to do and then they were going to canoe across it. And it was, so on the top of the mountain was a medical station. So what was I worrying about? I could have had a heart attack here and I would have been completely fine. So I chose a more remote route to go back down, because I'd had enough of the buzz of all of these people doing these incredible things. But the whole day had been predicated around de-risking. I'm not particularly confident with a compass, very confident with a map, not so much in fog. So making sure I wasn't going to be in any kind of situation like that. So that's where my risk setting goes. That's where, if I'm not going to be confident about my route finding, that's what makes me feel a bit anxious. But there's I don't know if you've encountered Linda Cracknell, who's in Wanderers and in Waymakers, but she's also written a number of blog posts and pieces for a website in Scotland that's really, really great, called Walk Islands. And she talks really winningly in those pieces about going camping solo and walking solo in the mountains I've just been talking about. She lives near Loch Tay. So she's been up in those mountains, and she speaks directly to the concerns that you've just been raising there, Anne, about the anxiety of going into these places alone. So she's a wonderful writer to just see, okay, so that's how you gradually increase your tolerance for these uncomfortable feelings. And the way in which she speaks about what she sees from her tent, that she's in alone on the mountaintop at dawn. It's enough to make your heart sing and lace up your boots and get straight up the hill. So that might be something that would be enjoyable to read as well. And it's something I suggest to anybody I hear who says, "Oh, I don't know if I could do it." Well, here's a great account of how you might go about that and why you might want to.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think that idea of, of de-risking, that of sort of saying, yeah, like any fear, there's certain things that you just you do it, and then it's not as bad as you think it is, and like that. So, but it's just interesting. And Natalie said something interesting, that it was urban places, empty urban spaces, that make her more anxious than rural ones. And I think that's also like what environments you're comfortable in. I also get some of that, empty urban spaces, but I walk with people sometimes who don't know cities, and who it's like, oh, the city, even if they're not alone, walking in the city makes them very nervous, and I'm very comfortable. The city per se doesn't make me nervous, but it's more like falling down a ravine or somebody jumping, less likely that someone's going to come and, jump out from behind a tree, but that's sort of where I feel, that kind of whatever, the irrational fear.
Yeah, to jump out from behind a tree, to do anything to anybody else in hills, I think we just take too much effort and planning that Who would
Right.
do that? Why would
Oh,
you do that?
It's all very primal. I mean, all these things, all these fears are very primal
Yeah.
in terms of that.
Yeah, and absolutely, but I think women get taught to fear
Mhm.
what isn't. As I say, we're not taught to fear our homes, but that's where it's dangerous. We are taught to fear outside, which is where it's probably safer. And I think it's those kinds of narratives that we perhaps want to challenge. Whether we feel comfortable walking in urban or rural environments, well, I guess that depends on whether you've ever tested your eyes on a moonlit night and know that it's perfectly possible to navigate, almost as well as you do in the day, or whether you're used to using street lamps and not having that assistance is actually uncomfortable. And neither is right, neither is better. They're just different. For me, rural feels more comfortable, but that's where I've spent more of my time. And that's all there is, really. It's just, I think, where you've practiced and where you've got used to.
Yeah. Interesting. Now, because we're reaching the end of our time, sadly, that went really quickly. Right. Well, thank you, Kerri. Yeah, that's amazing. We could talk longer, obviously. There's so much in your book. And I hope everyone enjoyed hearing what Kerri had to say. And if you want to join me on Thursday next week, May the 30th, I'm doing a kind of Waymakers Part 2. It's called the 3Ws Flash Workshop. And I'm going to shamelessly borrow some of the women from Kerri's terrific book and give writing prompts based on their funny, poignant, whatever musings on walking. And we're going to get down to doing a little bit of writing or coming up with ideas for creative writing off the back of Kerri's women. So thank you very much, everyone.